This is actually the first internationally published book on not only Duterte, but the phenomenon of right-wing or strongman populism in what I call emerging market democracies. So these are countries with some tradition of elections, some tradition of human rights and civil liberties. At the same time, they have been growing very fast in the past few years. Some of these countries have been the stars, the new stars in the global landscape. And then suddenly they elected, certain people who are now rolling back democratic values and democratic institutions. So I'm not only looking at Duterte, I'm looking at people like Recep Tayyip Erdogan in the case of Turkey, someone who was a hope for this kind of modern democracy in a modern Turkey not long ago, and now he's now seen as a new sultan of Turkey as he muzzles the oppositions, cracks down on journalists, and essentially silences any kind of opposition to his rule and centralizes it in his own office. I look at people like Narendra Modi in the case of India, who dislodged the old elite of the Congress party and now is pushing forward a much more Hindu nationalist agenda whereby, he's essentially othering or excluding the Muslims and Christians and other religious minorities that are not part of his narrative of a great India, a Hindu great India. So we also see a rollback in civil liberties and political rights in places like India, but at the same time you see huge amount of people inspired by Modi as this kind of strong leader who will make India great again. So in Turkey and India we see the similar thing. And in the case of the Philippines, the election of Rodrigo Duterte also came at a very interesting period. It came after a few years of rapid economic growth in the Philippines. The Philippines became the new star, the new darling of the international investor and international media under the Aquino administration. Aquino himself pushed for supposedly good governance initiatives, trying to put certain high-level officials in jail for corruption scandals. So you had this supposedly bright shining stars in the emerging market democracies, and then suddenly you have this more authoritarian leaning kind of leaders like Duterte coming. So what I try to do in the book is to make sense out of the situation. Why would people in Turkey or in India, or in the case of the Philippines more specifically, vote for someone like Duterte as the president? And a lot of people, almost voted into office Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the son of the former Filipino dictator, into the vice president office. In fact, the office of the vice president is still now being contested in the Supreme Court because Ferdinand Marcos lost by a very slim margin. And there are some concerns about irregularities. So the vice presidency could go to the son of the former dictator too, who, yes, he's not his father, but he has very much venerated his father as this great leader. In fact, Ferdinand Marcos said that if his father was not dislodged from office in the People Power Revolution in 1986, the Philippines would be something like Singapore. So there's that kind of veneration of the father going on. And I think both Marcos and Duterte, in their own ways, are rekindling what you call autocratic nostalgia, which is this nostalgia for a strong leader with an iron fist who brings discipline and progress to the country. Of course, his most successful models of that are people like Lee Kuan Yew in the case of Singapore, who was a little bit authoritarian, but actually made Singapore a global hub of prosperity and logistics hub, of course. Now, what I do in the book is try to provide the context. Because my problem was that I feel in the international media, in the coverage, in the current affairs coverage, what you call événementiel, like a daily affairs coverage, there's so much focus about, Duterte, his psyche, his violent streak, his war on drugs. But I think that misses the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is, why would a lot of Filipinos vote for Duterte? And why is Duterte very popular today? So what I do in the book is to show, if in the case of Turkey, a person like Erdogan managed to go this far, precisely because there was this enchantment with the former elite, this Western-looking elite who looked down at Islam and pious people. So these Muslim people in Turkey, these prosperous so-called Anatolian tigers, found their voice in someone like Erdogan. In the case of India, you have much more Hindu nationalist people who are prosperous, entrepreneurial, and they were tired with the Congress party's inefficiency and corruption and its hypocrisies, and they voted for Modi. In the case of the Philippines also, a lot of people voted for Duterte because they were also sick and tired of the hypocrisy and empty rhetoric of the former leaders. They talk about human rights, they talk about fighting corruption, but on the ground things were not changing so fast, or not fast enough, or not good enough. In fact, if anything, I show with data, with concrete data, that there was actually room for some sort of revolt in the last elections. So in my opinion, Aquino was the best president that the Philippines created since the fall of the Marcos, but the twist is the best was not enough, precisely because Aquino showed the hollowness of the system. So the Philippines was growing at 6.5% under Aquino, but out of the 6.5%, 5% just went to 40 families. So the World Bank data shows that 40 families, 0.0001% of the population, was taking home 76% of newly created growth. You look at the political system in the Philippines, it's as oligarchic. That's why I use the term elite democracy, revolt against elite democracy, as a subtitle in my book, because this was a revolt essentially against that oligarchy. Out of 81 provinces in the Philippines, 79 are controlled by around 170 political dynasties who are just like shuffling power among themselves. So the Philippine democracy was sham. Philippine capitalism was not free. It was controlled by few major conglomerates. So I think emergence of someone like Duterte was almost inevitable, precisely because of the inability of the predecessors of Duterte to break that deadlock in the system and to breach the gap between the rhetoric of democracy and prosperity and the reality of deprivation and political dynasties dominating almost all offices. So you have this, this comical and tragic, kind of anecdotal evidence whereby you go to a certain barangay, which is like a neighborhood, and you see, look at the names of the chairman, the vice chairman, the other officials. They're almost all family members or relatives or related to each other. And in no ways, for me, that captures the essence of what democracy should be. And one of the reasons is, of course, the Philippine Congress is 70% dominated by political dynasties. So even if the Philippine Constitution of 1987 has an anti-dynasty streak, the Congress, which was dominated by the very political dynasties, never passed an enabling law because that would go against their own interest. So in short, I think there was a systemic deadlock, and Duterte was seen as some sort of a solution to that problem. Now, my way of also understanding Duterte was put in a broader, process of modernization. So I actually, in the first two chapters don't talk much about the Philippines. They talk about democracy under siege and modernization and its discontents. So I look at the works of Hannah Arendt, for instance, who look at Germany in early 20th century, and why would a highly educated Germany go and rally behind some frustrated artist who was not even German and Austrian called Adolf Hitler, for instance. Or I look at the works of Antonio Gramsci in early 20th century Italy, and how suddenly you have the Italians rallying behind someone like Mussolini, right? Why these kinds of figures were so appealing in highly industrialized, educated societies like Germany and Italy in that early 20th century, right? So I see similar things also now in the early 20th century. So what Hannah Arendt and Friedrich Nietzsche and Gramsci were talking about were systemic contradictions that were inherent to the process of modernization. Because modernization, essentially forces us to get out of close-knit communities and go into these atomistic societies. Some people who are properly educated and prepared make it to the top of the pyramids. A lot of people love modernization. A lot of women love modernization because that takes them out of the oppressive patriarchy that you find in small communities. But a lot of people do not make it. A lot of people are uprooted and they don't find the solace and stability and certainty in the new modern context. So these people turn into what Hannah Arendt called mass society. These people who believe they're equal to everyone else, they believe they should have a voice in the system, but they're not properly equipped for that, or they were not fortunate to have the voice. So eventually, they build up what Friedrich Nietzsche calls ressentiment, this kind of deep resentment, a sense of, they're aggrieved, they're angry, they want to have a voice. So eventually, a lot of them find certainty in figures who promise essentially heaven on earth, or celebrate violence as a catharsis out of the deadlock of the hypocrisy of the system. So I felt that makes sense in the current context because, and this is where I look at much more contemporary literature. So Samuel Huntington, for instance, talk about the third wave of democracy, which started with the Carnations Revolution in Portugal in 1970s, reached its apotheosis between 1986 with the Philippine People Power Revolution and all the People Power Revolutions with the fall of the Berlin in 1989. But by the mid-1990s, a lot of these success stories, these beautiful stories of democratic emancipation from either communist rule or dictatorship, suddenly mutated into less impressive stories. So Farid Zakaria termed them illiberal democracies. So case in point, Russia. So Putin perhaps is genuinely popular because if you look at some surveys by private independent agencies, Putin has 60, 70, 80% approval ratings. And a lot of Russians really support Putin. And election-wise, I suppose, even if we had a very free and fair and competitive election, I think still Putin would pull it off. Probably get 55%, not 70, 80%. And so this illiberal democracy happened when people feel that the best way forward is with a decisive leader who doesn't have to bother with a corrupt Congress and checks and balances and all. So Putin created this new model of illiberal democracy. You're popular, you can win elections, but you don't give a heck about civil liberties, political rights, and checks and balances, which are inherent to any liberal democracy, based on the American model of democracy. So in recent years, we're seeing illiberal democracies emerging in other countries. In the case of Turkey, I think Erdogan is genuinely popular with at least half of Turkey. I think he can still win elections legitimately, even if it's fair and competitive. But clearly, he doesn't believe in checks and balances. He's very authoritarian in terms of his approach. So I think Duterte somehow is quite, similar in the sense that, this is a person who legitimately won the elections. Fair and square, he defeated the others. He's legitimately a very popular person, although we can explain that later on what popularity really means in the Philippines. But he seems to be very skeptical of checks and balances, of human rights, of civil liberties. Whenever he's criticized by another branch of the government, he openly threatens them. So now, for instance, Duterte is under investigation by the Ombudsman Office for supposed unexplained wealth. So the next thing he does is that he threatens the Ombudsman Office. When he's questioned by the Supreme Court Justice on he is, putting judges on his drug list, he attacked the Supreme Court Justice. When a certain Senator, Leila de Lima, tried to question him, now Leila de Lima is in jail based on charges of, abetting drug trafficking and all, which a lot of human rights groups and the European Union believe are just, politically trumped up charges. So we see this authoritarianization of still a fundamentally democratic system. So the liberal part is going out, but the election democracy part is still there.